two step-siblings, bound by forbidden desire, would ignite a scandal so dark that it would tear their once-perfect family apart. But when their hidden passion leads to an unimaginable tragedy, the shocking truth is revealed in the most horrific way possible. Among the town's most revered families were the Warrens. They lived in a grand colonial-style mansion on the edge of town, their wealth and status unmistakable. David Warren, a shrewd and successful businessman, had made a name for himself in real estate, building up a portfolio of properties throughout the county. His wife, Clara, was a woman of impeccable manners, always seen in tailored dresses, with pearls around her neck and a smile that hid the ice in her eyes. Together, they represented everything East Hollow aspired to be: successful, dignified, and well-respected. David had a son, Eli, from his previous marriage, a quiet but sharp-witted young man. Eli was David's pride and joy, groomed from a young age to take over the family business. Tall and athletic, Eli had the looks and charm of a future leader, though he often appeared distant, lost in thoughts of his own. He was popular at school but always kept people at arm's length, preferring solitude or the company of his books and music over the crowd. Clara's daughter, Emma, was quite the opposite. She was lively, outgoing, and the darling of the town. With her soft features and honey blonde hair, she was always the center of attention, whether it was at school events or charity functions her mother organized. Emma had inherited her mother's social grace, but had a rebellious streak she kept hidden from public view. Behind her sparkling eyes was a girl who craved more than the small-town life she was destined for. Though not related by blood, Eli and Emma had grown up together since their parents married when they were 12 and 11, respectively. Their early years were filled with sibling-like bickering, shared vacations, and awkward family dinners where they learned to coexist. But as they grew older, their relationship took on a different dynamic, one neither of them quite understood at the time. The story truly begins during their senior years of high school. Eli, who had been dating a girl named Rachel, had been in what many considered the perfect teenage relationship. Rachel was smart, beautiful, and came from a good family. Their relationship had been steady, almost boring in its predictability. But for reasons Eli never fully grasped, Rachel broke up with him one afternoon, leaving him stunned. She told him that he was emotionally unavailable, distant in ways she couldn't tolerate anymore. Emma's heartbreak came on the very same day. She had been seeing Tyler, a football player with a bad boy reputation. Their relationship had been turbulent, filled with passionate highs and devastating lows. That evening, Tyler told her he was leaving town to go live with his father in another state, ending their relationship with a coldness that left Emma reeling. Both Eli and Emma retreated into themselves after their breakups, their shared pain bringing them closer in unexpected ways. Though they had spent years avoiding any real emotional connection, their mutual suffering created a new bond between them. It started with casual conversations, each one confiding their hurt and frustration, comparing heartbreaks. Over time, they began spending more nights together, sitting in Eli's room or Emma's, talking late into the night about their shattered dreams of love. One late summer evening, when the air was thick with humidity and the sounds of crickets filled the night, Eli and Emma found themselves alone in the house. Their parents had gone out of town for a weekend charity gala, leaving the siblings to their own devices. The evening began innocently enough. Pizza, a movie, and the usual late-night conversation about their respective failed relationships. But something was different this time. There was a tension neither had felt before, a strange energy in the room that made their usual banter feel charged with something dangerous. As they sat on Eli's bed, side by side, their conversation drifted from the pain of their breakups to the feeling of being unloved. Emma, with her head resting on Eli's shoulder, sighed deeply, and before either of them realized what was happening, the moment changed. What had been sibling comfort and closeness turned into something more physical. A touch lingered too long, a glance held too intensely. Without words, they crossed the line. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, but it quickly escalated. Neither of them stopped it, neither pulled away. In the heat of the moment, all the rules they had known, all the boundaries that had kept them apart as step-siblings dissolved. What was left was raw emotion, pure desire born from pain and longing. When it was over, they lay there in silence, the reality of what they had done washing over them like a cold wave. Emma's breath hitched as the guilt set in. "What have we done?" she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Eli stared at the ceiling, his chest heavy with a mix of regret and confusion. "It was a mistake," Eli finally said, his voice hollow. "We'll forget about it. It never happened." They swore to themselves it would never happen again. But deep down, both knew that what had started that night wasn't going to stop. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Days turned into weeks, and despite their initial promises, the pull between them grew stronger. At first, it was sporadic, late-night trysts when the house was empty, moments stolen in the shadowy corners of the house where no one would see. Each time they swore it was the last. But as time passed, their encounters became more frequent, more dangerous. It wasn't just about the physical act anymore. There was something dark and intoxicating about the secrecy, about the fact that they were doing something forbidden, the thrill of nearly getting caught. The rush of adrenaline when they heard their parents coming home added fuel to the fire. They became addicts to the danger, to the excitement of living on the edge of discovery. But with every passing week, the guilt also grew heavier. Emma would often cry after they were together, whispering that it was wrong, that they were ruining everything. Eli would try to comfort her, but even his words felt hollow. He knew it was wrong. Every fiber of his being screamed it, but there was something primal that kept pulling him back to her. Their lives outside the house became a carefully constructed facade. They continued to live as the perfect step-siblings in public. Eli focusing on his studies and preparing for college, while Emma immersed herself in school clubs and social events. No one suspected a thing, not even their parents, who were too busy maintaining their image in the town to notice the subtle changes in their children's behavior. But cracks were beginning to show. David and Clara weren't oblivious, and though they hadn't yet uncovered the full extent of what was happening, they sensed something wasn't right. Eli and Emma were spending far too much time together, their closeness growing in ways that felt unnatural for siblings, even step-siblings. The tension in the house grew palpable, a storm brewing beneath the surface. One night, as Eli and Emma sat together in their usual spot in Eli's room, Emma turned to him with tears in her eyes. "We have to stop," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't live like this anymore. The guilt is eating me alive." Eli stared at her, knowing she was right, but his heart ached at the thought of losing the one person who understood him, the one person who had been there through everything. "I know," he whispered, but how? Neither of them had the answer, and so the cycle continued: desire, regret, shame, and back to desire again. The atmosphere in the Warren household had changed. David and Clara, though absorbed in their own social lives, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with their children. The late-night outings, the hours spent locked away in their rooms, and the occasional awkward tension during family dinners were all too noticeable. At first, they assumed it was just teenage rebellion. Perhaps Eli and Emma were sneaking out to meet friends, or maybe they were going through the typical adolescent phase of distancing themselves from their parents. But something about their relationship felt off. They were too close, too comfortable with each other in a way that didn't seem right for step-siblings. It wasn't just the physical proximity. It was the looks they shared, the way they seemed to understand each other's thoughts without speaking. David had caught them exchanging a glance at the dinner table once. a look that lingered too long, filled with an intensity that made his stomach turn. Clara, too, had her suspicions, but she was in denial. She didn't want to believe anything could be wrong with her perfect family. So, when David suggested they install cameras in the house to monitor what was happening, she reluctantly agreed. The cameras weren't placed in their children's bedrooms. That would be too invasive, but in the hallways, common areas, and outside the house. They told themselves it was just a precaution, a way to keep an eye on their kids when they were away. At first, the footage revealed nothing unusual. Just the normal comings and goings of teenagers, the occasional late-night snack run, or a sneaky trip outside. But then, one night, the footage captured something that would shatter their world. It was a quiet night. David and Clara were out at a charity dinner, leaving Eli and Emma alone in the house once again. They had been cautious lately, aware that their parents were growing suspicious, but the temptation was too strong. As soon as the house was empty, they retreated to Eli's room, where the air was thick with tension and unspoken words. This time, the encounter was more desperate than ever. They knew they were playing with fire, that each time could be the last, but neither could resist the pull. As they fell into each other's arms once again, lost in the heat of the moment, the camera outside Eli's room picked up movement, a shadow passing by, a door quietly shutting. It was enough to trigger the recording. The next day, David reviewed the footage. What he saw made his heart stop. At first, it was just the sight of Emma entering Eli's room, which might have been innocent enough. But then the hours passed, and neither of them emerged. The silence in the house was deafening, and when David replayed the footage, he noticed the subtle details. The way they looked at each other, the way their bodies moved in sync, the unmistakable signs of intimacy. He felt sick to his stomach. This couldn't be happening. "Clara, come here," he called, his voice trembling. When she saw the footage, her face went pale. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David couldn't speak. His mind was reeling, trying to process what he had just seen. His children, his son and stepdaughter, were involved in something unspeakable. The shame, the disgust, the betrayal, it all came crashing down on him at once. Their family was falling apart, and he had no idea how to stop it. That night, David and Clara didn't speak to their children. They needed time to process what they had discovered, to figure out how to approach the situation without making it worse. But the tension in the house was unbearable. Eli and Emma could feel it. They knew something was wrong. They had been careful, but not careful enough. Their parents' cold stares and strained voices made it clear that the truth was closing in on them. Finally, after days of silence, David called them into the living room. His face was a mask of controlled fury, while Clara sat beside him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Eli and Emma sat across from them, their hearts pounding in their chests. "We know," David said, his voice low and steady. "We know what you've been doing." Eli's stomach dropped. He glanced at Emma, who was already on the verge of tears. They had been caught, and there was no way out. What do you mean?" Eli stammered, though he knew it was pointless. "Don't lie to us," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We've seen the footage. We know everything." There was a long, heavy silence. Eli and Emma sat frozen, their minds racing for a way to explain, to justify what they had done. But there were no excuses that could make this right. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now they had to face the consequences. As the confrontation escalated, emotions ran high. Clara was sobbing uncontrollably, while David's rage simmered just below the surface. He couldn't believe that his children had done something so vile, so unforgivable. "How could you do this to us?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "How could you betray your own family like this?" Eli and Emma tried to explain, but their words were incoherent, lost in the flood of guilt and shame. They couldn't explain why they had done it, why they had let it go on for so long. The truth was, they didn't know themselves. In the days that followed, the house became a prison. Eli and Emma were kept under strict supervision, their every move monitored. But despite their parents' efforts to keep them apart, the bond between them remained unbreakable. They knew they couldn't go back to the way things were before, but they couldn't imagine a life without each other either. One night, in a final act of defiance, Eli and Emma snuck out of their rooms and met in the darkness of Eli's bedroom. The guilt, the shame, it was all too much. But even in their despair, they couldn't resist the pull of their twisted love. But this time, something went horribly wrong. As they tried to separate, a wave of panic washed over them. Their bodies wouldn't come apart. Pain shot through Eli's body, and Emma's sobs filled the room as they realized they were stuck together in the most grotesque way possible. Hours passed as they tried desperately to free themselves, but nothing worked. In agony and defeat, they were forced to call for help. When David and Clara burst into the room, the sight that greeted them was nothing short of horrific. Their children, naked and helpless, were bound together in a grotesque manifestation of their secret shame. For a moment, neither parent could move, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what they were seeing. Clara let out a strangled cry and collapsed to the floor, while David stood frozen in shock. "Call an ambulance," Eli gasped, his voice hoarse with pain. "Please." David snapped out of his stupor and fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking uncontrollably. As he dialed a number, he could barely think. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. His family wasn't supposed to end like this. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and the paramedics quickly assessed the situation. They exchanged grim looks, realizing the severity of what had occurred. As they worked to move Eli and Emma, they spoke in hushed tones, their words lost in the haze of panic and pain that filled the room. The ride to the hospital was silent, except for the occasional groan of pain from Eli. Emma's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't stop trembling, her mind racing with the realization that this was the end of everything. The secret was out, and there was no going back. At the hospital, the situation grew even more dire. The only way to separate Eli and Emma was through surgery, but the procedure came with a horrific cost. Eli's genitals had been severely damaged during the ordeal, and the doctors explained that the only option was to amputate in order to save his life. The decision had to be made quickly. There was no time to delay. David and Clara stood outside the operating room, their hearts heavy with the weight of the decision they had to make. Clara was sobbing uncontrollably, while David stared blankly at the floor, unable to process the nightmare unfolding around him. "We have no choice," the doctor said, his voice gentle but firm. "If we don't operate now, he won't survive." Clara clutched David's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't lose him. We can't." But by the time they were ready for surgery, it was already too late. Eli had lost too much blood, and his body couldn't take the strain. He died on the operating table, his last moments filled with regret and terror. When the doctor came to tell them the news, Clara let out a wail that echoed through the sterile hospital halls. David stood in stunned silence, his mind unable to comprehend the words. Their son was gone. The boy they had raised, the child they had loved, was dead because of something so twisted, so wrong that they could hardly believe it had happened at all. Emma, who had survived the procedure, was left alone to face the consequences of their actions. She was discharged from the hospital a few days later, but she was a shell of her former self. The bright, lively girl who had once been the darling of East Hollow was gone, replaced by a hollow, broken woman who could barely look at herself in the mirror. The news of Eli's death spread quickly through East Hollow. It wasn't long before the full extent of the scandal became public knowledge. Whispers spread through the town like wildfire, and the Warrens, once the most respected family in the community, became the subject of gossip and judgment. David and Clara retreated from public life, unable to face the humiliation and shame that now defined their existence. Clara, once the socialite and pillar of the community, became a recluse, rarely leaving the house. David, once the powerful businessman, could barely function, his mind consumed by the loss of his son and the disgrace that had befallen his family. One cold autumn evening, Emma made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. The weight of her guilt had become unbearable, and she saw no way out. She couldn't face the world, couldn't bear the whispers, the judgment, the memories of what she and Eli had done. She wrote a letter, just a few short sentences, and left it on the kitchen table. It was addressed to her parents, though she knew they would likely never see it. In the letter, she apologized for everything, for ruining their lives, for destroying the family. She wrote that she couldn't live with the guilt anymore, that she hoped they would one day find peace. That night, Emma quietly left the house and walked to the nearby river. The water was cold and unforgiving, but it was the only escape she could see. She waded in slowly, the chill of the water biting at her skin, until she was submerged beneath its surface. When Emma's body was found the next morning, the town of East Hollow was shaken to its core. The tragic end of the Warren family's saga left the town reeling. What had once been whispered about in secret was now openly discussed, as everyone tried to make sense of how such a respected family had fallen so far. The media frenzy reignited briefly, but even the news outlets eventually lost interest. The Warrens were now a cautionary tale, a dark reminder of how even the most perfect-seeming families could harbor unspeakable secrets. David, now truly alone, sold the house and disappeared from public life. No one in East Hollow knew where he went or what became of him, and in time, people stopped asking. Clara, devastated by the loss of her children and her marriage, moved to a distant city where she tried to rebuild her life in anonymity. But the scars of what had happened would never fully heal. The town of East Hollow moved on, as towns do, but the memory of the Warrens lingered like a ghost, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath even the most pristine surface. In the end, there were no clear answers, no satisfying resolution to the tragedy. The Warren story ended not with redemption or understanding, but with silence. The question of how love and pain could become so entangled, how a family could unravel so completely, would haunt anyone who dared to think too deeply about it. And perhaps that was a real tragedy, that in their search for love and comfort, Eli and Emma had found only destruction. Their story was one of regret and loss, a reminder that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed.